I guess that there we go. I guess that's not news to you. And we often think of the stress of parenting as being something like this, that, you know, we're juggling lots of things and it's quite difficult, but we're managing. But I wanted just to acknowledge today that there is a dark side to being a parent, that the stress of parenting can often tip into a real questioning of your purpose and the point of everything that you're doing, that can have a very, very deep impact on your mental health. And we know mental health is affected by stress, but I think there's a lot more than just stress that comes with being a parent in the modern world, and that's what I'm really talking about here. So this little quote I found was quite useful. It's learning about strengths, so we're overcoming stressors, we're really strong, but it's also dealing with fears and darkness that we didn't really know existed prior to becoming a parent, prior to taking on that role. And as a mother, now this is just off the top of my head, some of the things that mothers grapple with, that I've certainly grappled with, things like body image, relationships, the change, the shift. How are we going to cope with the pressure, the financial pressure of being a parent as well? It's absolutely huge. And then there's this idea of you're connected, you're living your life for another person, and what about your life and your place in the world? As a mother, I think you are dependent. You have a level of dependence on the people that you have around you, on the society that you have around you. And that is really, really disconcerting, particularly if you're used to being independent. And of course, then you've got this person who's depending on you. Absolutely huge things, huge shifts. There's the whole question of, can I even do this? This is supposed to be natural, but it's not natural. Is it natural? How come I'm not finding this natural? And then the sense of, I must get this right for this other person. And then the sense of, have I ruined my own life, and am I actually ruining my child's life? And I have to say, I have tipped into all of these thought patterns at various different stages. And so much of the rhetoric and narrative around maternal mental health has been about the importance of looking after parents so that the children are okay. But I mean, I would really want to say, well, what about the parents and the suffering themselves? You know, what about their mental health and their well-being, particularly the women who tend to end up having to do a lot of this stuff for all sorts of reasons, but we end up being the ones that do it. So this is not about stress. This is about something that's actually so much deeper than stress. And it's really, really, really important to acknowledge that. Now, this is figures from the Centre of Mental Health. Up to 20% of women develop a mental health problem during pregnancy or within a year of giving birth. It sounds low to me. You know, if you were to measure even the mild mental health problems, the mental illness, it must be a lot higher than this, because just the pressure that we're under is so great. And we do live in a society where the answer in terms of maternal mental health seems to be this. Yeah, you're going to expect this because of your hormones. Wow. Like, I mean, it's completely dismissive. It's like, oh yeah, this is par for the course, but nobody recognizes the structural features of our society that influence women's mental health. So that's the problem. You know, that's a problem that I have as well. Now, mental health is costly, and we need to talk about the cost of mental illness and mental ill health, because, you know, we have to make arguments here about spending money on preventing and intervening and treating mental illness here, and we're competing against other things. So it's really important that we get the figures right. You know, don't get the figures right, but we actually have the figures for this. So a Mental Health Foundation report a few weeks ago actually found that the cost of poor mental health to Northern Ireland is £3.4 billion annually, each and every single year. That's what it's costing our economy. Now, I'm pointing at the mental health strategy is 1.2 billion over 10 years. So obviously this is going to be a good investment. And much of this mental illness is actually preventable. It's important to say that much of it's preventable, and a lot of the rest of it is we can reduce the cost of it by treating it. So it's treatable, it's preventable and treatable, and we can reduce that economic cost by getting in early. And that doesn't even touch or begin to reflect the suffering, the human suffering that we are talking about here, and the ripples across society and across families. So it's really important that we invest in intervention, early intervention and prevention, and then treat mental illness when it arises. Now, next slide here. Oh, whoops, oh gosh, we're way on ahead. My keypad's stuck there. I think there's crumbs in my keyboard from all the eating that I do at the desk. So mental health, what is mental health? When I was studying psychology, and certainly when I did my master's a long time ago in health psychology, we talked about mental health being biopsychosocial. It's biological. Yeah, we know that. We've known that for a long time. Psychological and social. I'm actually adding on relational now, because what we know is that mental health is fostered through relationships. Good mental health and well-being is about strong relationships and social connections in families, between individuals and families and communities. There's so much evidence now that we are connected, literally connected to the people around us. We're not individuals. Our brains are wired into each other's brains. So when we see somebody in a face-to-face, we can tell at a subconscious level. It's chemical. There's pheromones, there's chemicals, there's mirror neurons in our brains that detect other people's feelings, and that affects us. So the idea that we're individuals is no longer true. We're actually part of a broader neurological network, and we're firing off each other. And we don't even have to touch to do that, but we do need to be close to each other. We do need to see each other in order to feel safe. You know, and this connection through the pandemic has been really difficult. And that's one of the reasons, because we don't have that face-to-face stuff that helps keep us settled. We don't have that neuroception. So good mental health is relational. And those relationships, particularly in families, are so important. Those relationships between the pack animals, between all the animals in the pack. And we know that the relationship between parents and children is so predictive of mental health and well-being and outcomes across the lifespan. And this is attachment theory. Again, showing that the attachments, the chemical attachments that are fostered through closeness, through proximity, those chemical attachments, those physical attachments that happen, they're physical and they're in the brains. They nurture that nurtures the child's brain and helps shape their brain development. So relationships are so important. Another concept I want to introduce is the trauma continuum, because that's relevant as well. So we have necessary stress, and then we have distress and trauma, which is overwhelming. And it's important that we know the difference there. But most of the time we want to be in that state of psychological safety where we're safe and well. And it's the fight or flight, the stress and the overwhelming distress that increases the risk of mental health problems, because it dysregulates us, it affects us. The chemicals that change in our bodies that protect us, that have been designed to help us survive, they're related to a risk of mental illness as well. So this is a biological dysregulation that comes as a result of stress and distress and trauma that leads to changes in our feelings and our behaviour, and that's what mental illness is. But relationships are what heals us and connects us, and relationships are so important to this whole picture as well. So that's it. So I like to use the little meerkats picture as an example. Of how this all works. So if you can see there, it's a little pack of meerkats, and that's like us as families. We are a social species. Our neuroception, that's what that's called. When we're tuned into the state of other mammals, that's called neuroception. And we're mirroring the survival states of everybody else in the herd. So the herd is the unit here, not the individual. And the calmness and safety and sense of well-being are contagious as well. But the leaders in the herd are really important. And the parents are the leaders. So the political representatives up there are the leaders as well. But in the family and in communities, we have parents they're essentially the leaders, and they are setting the tone. So if the parents are well, everybody else feels well and feels well regulated. Because of that connection, because we're looking to the leaders to set the tone, to tell us how we should be. So calmness, safety, a sense of well-being, all contagious and can all spread if you have that well-regulated leader. So self-care is leadership, and leadership is actually self-care. That's your first job, is to be well regulated, to be well yourself so everybody else can be well. And there's so much evidence that the relationship between a parent and a child's mental health, there's just a sort of linear connection between the two. And And whenever one changes, the other changes. So the saying that you're only as well as your least, you're only as mentally healthy as your least mentally healthy child is true as well. As parents, we get affected by our children's mental health. But as parents, if we look after ourselves, it's a really, really powerful signal to our children and to everybody else in the family. So parenting must be about self-care. And I don't mean self-care as in bubble baths and glasses of Prosecco and all of this sort of stuff. It's self-care about knowing when we need help, asking for help, drawing boundaries, saying no, having challenging conversations about what we can and can't do in order to protect ourselves so that we can be good pack leaders and so that our children can be well. So going back to that Mental Health Foundation report of the 3.4 billion, really, really interesting report. You should get a hold of it if you can. They also reviewed the best value for money interventions. So they were using a very economic perspective here. And they selected a series of interventions which were particularly good value for money because they worked to reduce the cost of mental health problems, and they were cost effective themselves. They didn't cost too much, and the investment was rewarded in terms of mental health outcomes. And the first one there, as you can see, is Universal Health Visitor Delivered Identification of Risk of Perinatal Depression, followed by psychological therapies. That was their kind of number one. Now, the criteria here was really, really strict. They had to have really good evidence. And there's so much evidence that supporting parents, that getting in there and identifying, particularly the woman with postnatal depression, that by spending money and doing that and treating those women, it will pay you dividends, and it's cheap to do that. After that, it's parenting programs. So parents are a really, really important part of all of this. And it's about their suffering, but also about the next generation. And then we've got stuff around schools, programs, exercises, and identification of risk for adults and psychological therapies for adults. And you can see the rest of them there as well. But I find it really fascinating that the first two were related to parenting and how we support parents. The parenting programs is about supporting parents to be parents. It's not just about telling them how to parent. Let me tell you that that's not what they involve. It's about that self-awareness as well. So let me have a look. So what is the picture in terms of our young people in Northern Ireland? It's important to know this is really good data from 2019, just before the pandemic. 1 in 8 of our young people had a mood or anxiety disorder. See, 1 in 10 had conduct problems, 1 in 7 have hyperactivity, and these mental health problems were much more prominent in the most deprived areas of Northern Ireland. So the stress of poverty and deprivation is a factor there that affects parents and young people as well. 1 in 6 of our young people had disordered eating, 1 in 10 had self-harmed, and 1 in 8, almost 1 in 8, thought about or attempted suicide. So the rates of mental health problems in our young people are really high, and they're 25% higher than other places. And there's also good data showing the rates of mental health problems in adults are also really, really high here. We used to be about 25% higher than England, and England's rates have sadly increased. So that gap is much, much narrower now. Ours haven't gone down, so there's a lot of mental health problems across society. And when we look at the biggest predictor of mental health problems is childhood adversities in childhood. And this is from that same study. You can see there that number 8, parental mental health, per mental health. There's a wee C on there for some reason on the table. I just cut and pasted it in. So, but parental mental health problems are reported there by 10%, 10.7% of children and young people. And that's considered an adversity that does increase your risk of mental health problems. And it's one of the highest one is parental separation, which is actually so common that if it's managed properly, it needn't be an adversity. But fascinating that 1 in 10 of our young people are reporting that their parents had mental health problems. So that's really, really related to their risk of mental illness going forward across their lifespan. So I'm going to flick on past this little bit to talk about trauma-informed practice and how important that is for parental mental health here. So that little model that I showed you earlier is, psychological safety, and then we have stress and distress, and that's what creates the dysregulation. If you get stuck in that state of stress or distress, that dysregulation, that physical change that happens, can lead to the symptoms and behaviors of mental health that are mental health problems, the feelings and the behaviors that we recognize to be mental health problems. And that whole recognition is what trauma-informed practice is. It's a move away from thinking what's wrong with you, what's the label that we have for you here, to thinking what has happened to you, what's the stress and the distress that has led to this dysregulation that's left you feeling like this. And it's a good model to apply to parental mental health as well, because you see all of the challenges, all of the darkness, and that darkness can be really, really distressing. And that's what activates us, that's what changes us, it changes our bodies. And we do become stuck in states of anxiety and deep, deep sadness. And that's what mental health problems are for parents. So we're moving from thinking about what's wrong with you to what has happened to you. And when we apply these lenses, when we put on our trauma-informed glasses, we see the world in a different way. We see violence and aggression differently. We see withdrawal and disengagement differently. And in parents, violence and aggression is hyper-vigilance, shouting, not being able to control your temper, even using physical punishment against a child, and there's solid evidence there of the harm that can have. And then there's that withdrawal and disengagement that happens when there's trauma. And again, that's associated with the things that have happened to the parent that's left them like that. But that has a big impact on the connection that they can have with their child and the environment that's created for that child as well. So transgenerational trauma really is about the transmission of parental trauma to children, but it's in the form of ACEs mostly. There's some evidence of the biological changes that can create epigenetic changes to the child's stress response, but there's much more evidence around this stuff. Parental trauma, parental stress, parental distress, impacting on a parent's ability to attend to their child's needs. So it's about attachment, which is related to regulation, mentalization, empathy in children, and impacts their stress activation and how well it can calm themselves down. It's even related to social problems and prejudice and all of that, because the child's less well able to read and understand other people's positions, how they see the world. So it can be related to prejudice as well. And then children sometimes copy what they see their parents doing, which means they're copying that hypervigilance. They're modeling that. They're modeling if there's violence, if there's reactivity, stress reactivity, children will copy that as well. So nearly at the end here. What does this mean for maternal mental health? Well, actually, we need to reduce the causes of stress and distress. We need to reduce the darkness for parents. We need quality childcare and community support. That's where it starts. It's not about teaching parents. Parenting skills is helpful, but if we could change the structural issues that impact on parents' mental health, then we would be taking all that stuff away. Which is even cheaper still. We need to raise awareness generally of the importance of attachment and early relationships in this precious time, the first 4 years of a child's life. And we need to raise awareness by putting child development into the curriculum, by making sure everybody across society is aware of the importance of ACEs and what trauma looks like, how it looks in a child and an adult, and what we can do about it. We need early intervention, of course, for mental health difficulties. If a parent or a child has mental health difficulties, we need to get in as early as we can to reduce the impact on every aspect of that person's life. And we need perinatal mental health services. And thanks to some amazing campaigners, including Lindsay, we have perinatal mental health services in Northern Ireland now. But there's so much more beneath that we need. We need therapeutic approaches to family, relationship, play therapy, all of that stuff in our therapy hubs. And we're still developing those. We don't have those well developed. And we need hubs that are accessible so the parents can come at a time that suits them, which means that the locations might be a wee bit different from the traditional GP practices and GP practice hours. So there's a lot more we can do, but things like a childcare strategy, an anti-poverty strategy, all of that program for government stuff, that's all relevant to this issue too. So finally, and I would say this, our mental health strategy is here and it's really good. There's 3 themes. There's the early intervention and prevention, promoting resilience. It's all there. The action plan for early interventions, action 2. Providing the right services at the right time, and even those new ways of working. But we have a strategy, we have a funding plan, we don't have funding yet. So we're still waiting on that. So we need to progress. The department are progressing through the year 1 actions as best they can, doing the preparatory work so that we can keep going with this. So we're still on track. But I'm worried about what's going to happen now in the years ahead. So thank you very much for listening, and apologies for all those delays at the start, which was my fault completely.
Thank you so much, Siobhan, for being with us. We really enjoyed your presentation and so much important work in that. Can I just pick up a couple of, there's a couple of questions that have come through, just if we can pick those up before, and I know you probably need to go on, but particularly around that that last screen there around the funding, which is really key. And we know that you have been calling for the funding to happen. Is there anything that people can get involved with to try and help push that funding forward, or any way they can support you in that call, or where are we at with that?
So, well, myself and a load of mental health charities have got the social media campaign, Plug the Gap. I think the most important thing is we raise awareness about this so that we can put pressure, you know, from whatever way we want, but we need to raise awareness of the fact that we need this funding. So I think that's important. So look at what we're saying, Plug the Gap, talk about the stuff publicly, talk about the stuff to your elected representatives, to the community leaders, to anybody who's in a position of influence. And that's my approach to this at the minute. But we're still working hard there to do what we can do. And if you follow me even on Twitter, I'll be able to give you updates about what's happening. And then if there's anything that's not happening, I'll let you know about that as well.
And thank you. And was there any sort of commitment beforehand to the fund from others to see this funding coming, or?
That's really important, actually. So I wrote to all the political leaders, and there's cross-party support for this. So that's a really important point. This is not a controversial thing. So all of the political parties have put this in their manifestos, which is really, really reassuring, which means it's on the agenda there already. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to progress it on that basis, that this is not controversial. It's not. The strategy itself was signed off by a minister. It's really important that it was signed off so we can keep going with that strategy, and it's a 10-year strategy. So the strategy is not sitting on a shelf. It's certainly not. It's being used at the minute, and it's signed off by a minister. So we don't need, there's no debate that needs to be had about whether or not we do this, or everybody's in support of it.
Great. So it's just about when, not if, but when.
Not if, but when, but accelerating that and keeping it on the agenda there. You know, I'd be scared it would slip down, because there are other issues that are really, and their impact on mental health as well, but we need to do this, you know, we need to do this strategy.
Absolutely. And just one final thing before we let you go on. You mentioned, and it's been mentioned a few times throughout the morning, the importance of childcare. And one of the things we've been hearing a lot about, how not having access to childcare and space even to work on your mental health can actually have an impact on parents, particularly when they're looking maybe to try and get some help and support. And finding funding for childcare for parents generally themselves is a problem and an issue. It also can be hard to even just get that childcare funding support for organisations to support childcare for parents. Is there anything that we could or should be doing around that and the mental health strategy, or looking into that issue?
So action 2 of the mental health strategy is a plan for early intervention and prevention, and that must include aspects, you know, social factors that influence on people's mental health at critical periods. So I think that action plan has actually been, it's been progressed, right? But I think it needs to include a childcare strategy, or there needs to be a demand now for a childcare strategy, because this is, you know, this is so important. We get less free childcare than other regions. You know, this is a disparity, and it's seen as a woman's issue. It's seen as about children and women, and sure, they're going to school and it's grand. I know it's just so, I know personally, like this is so hard. It's so important, and it's about quality childcare. It's not about you know, it's about paying childminders properly and recognizing the skilled work that involves. I think the review of education is a really important piece of this overall puzzle as well. I'm trying to get them to consider putting in like mandatory child development in the curriculum, you know, as a subject that all young people need to be doing, so that they can understand the importance of this. It's only when you really have that the penny drops about how valuable this work is, you know. So we need to keep shouting about childcare and maternity leave and all of those things, and paternity leave, of course, and equality, so that men can get time off, and that it's more socially acceptable for men to be spending time with their children as well. So there's a lot of shifts and changes I think we need, Lindsay, before we really get this right. But fair play to you and all of the groups that are here today, and everybody that's in the lobbying groups that have worked on this issue. Like this, you know, there's been immense progress too.
Well, look, thank you so much. It's been absolutely fantastic, as always, to have you with us today. Thank you for your presentation and for all you've shared, and for the really important work that you do on behalf of everyone here in Northern Ireland in your role. So thanks so much for joining us. And as Siobhan said, do follow her on social media if you don't already, and keep up to date with all the important work she's doing around the mental health strategy and the very important funding that's coming for that. So thank you again, Siobhan. Our next speaker will be Dr. Janine Lynch, who will be taking us through where the specialist perinatal mental health services are here for Northern Ireland. So I know many of you are also keen to hear about that development. So do log out of this and log back in and join me for that talk, and I'll see you there.